with Akshay, but we move from the higher education to high school level.
Good afternoon, and once again, thank you for having me here. It's a huge honor. I think especially because I'm following people with a lot more experience at doing this than I have. Avanti is only a few years old, and I think what I'd love to take a few minutes to talk about is this really radical experiment that we were sort of pushed into running. And I think what we found hopefully has some clues to, as Vijay described, what needs to happen in the classroom in terms of especially student collaboration that could complement effectively the abundance of knowledge that we now have. So, the challenge with India, and I think with most high school classrooms, and I can convince you this is the last time you will see Spider-Man on the presentation screen, but is really that we believe that our teachers or people who run our classrooms need to be superheroes. If you take any profession in the world, there's perhaps no profession that requires someone to be incredibly empathetic to students, to be inspiring, to know subject matter, to keep up with knowledge that doubles every day, just like we expect our teachers to. And I think as a consequence of this presumption, in countries such as India, we end up with huge disparities in terms of quality of our learning outcomes. So in India alone, and this is sort of the premise behind which we started Avanti, was that there's 1 million teachers short in our public school system. So that's more people than some countries have. So we are short of 1 million teachers. And it becomes even more confounding when you say that those 1 million teachers need to all be 1 million superheroes. And the task of finding 1 million superheroes is a task I doubt any country is ever going to achieve. And I think it's all predicated, and when we started, it was all predicated on the fact that we could take smart and motivated kids, give them great teachers, and that they would succeed. Unfortunately, in most academic settings, when you do that, when you give kids access to even great classrooms, we find that the vast majority of our classrooms don't succeed. In traditional classrooms, there's a top 5 or 10%, and there's always the traditional bell curve, and you find that the vast majority of your classroom does not succeed. And in many ways, it makes one question the efficacy of what we are doing in our classrooms. About 2 years ago, we started a bit of a strange experiment where we said, we can't find teachers, we're 1 million teachers short, so let's take these teachers out of the classroom, let's replace them with people who can handle students, let's replace them with responsible adults, and let's create a program that's entirely centered around students collaborating. So our classrooms were designed to have groups of 5 or 6 students work on subject matter that was designed for student collaboration and work together to create knowledge, as the speakers before have alluded to. And what we found was quite startling, which was that when we removed teachers from classrooms, but replaced them with responsible adults that encouraged collaborative learning, and if you look at the yellow curve there on the screen, not only did we perform better than traditional classrooms, we also resulted in much smaller variances in student performance. So our kids did better, but they also did less, their performance was a lot less disparate from each other. And the shocking revelation there for us, in this extreme scenario that we created, was that students studying by themselves were outperforming some of the most premium classrooms in the country. And I think this is important to ponder on, especially when we discuss the MOOCs, because there's been a lot of data in the past year and a half, which would lead you to believe, and leads many of us to believe, that traditional classrooms are outperforming the MOOCs, and they are, I think, in most settings. But what I would love to leave here is the thought that in extreme settings, when we were able to outperform traditional classrooms by removing teachers. So it's not really a question of how the content is delivered or how the knowledge is delivered. It's entirely a question of what students do when they are consuming that information. Here's a graph that Eric, who will talk tomorrow, often shows, and I'll run through it quickly, but these are MIT students fitted with electrodermal sensors. And the simplest way to look at these graphs is to interpret spikes as increased levels of arousal and troughs as a lack of mental arousal. And if you take a careful look at class, which is the yellow bars, you will find that it's largely flat. If you take a careful look at TV, which is the other thing we make most of our students do, it's also largely flat. But if you look at sleep, the conclusion you can draw is that our students are often more awake when they're asleep than they are when we are teaching them. And if you take a look at homework or at lab work, you'll again find that students are very, very stimulated. So how we design our program is in many ways similar to the flipped classroom, where close to 90% of all the time that students spend is split half and half roughly between studying by themselves and then doing very, very organized collaborative work with content. And only 10% of the time that they spend is spent, we're working in a more traditional environment with tutors or TAs. And when we did this, we found that our outcomes or our students' performance was so high that they were 2.5 times more likely to qualify amongst the top 1% in the country than more traditional programs. Just to ponder on about the MOOCs once again, I think the point that I really want to leave behind is, and especially in addition to what was said before, is the MOOCs are another way to deliver information. I think what they've done is made the information world flat, as Vijay said. What's really important is that we spend a lot of time on figuring out what do students do with this information, which is really independent of how that information is delivered. It has a lot to do with how do we get our students to engage with each other, create knowledge, and push the boundaries of what they can learn. And when teaching becomes less about teaching knowledge, as it has in this world, and a lot more about teaching how to learn and how to create knowledge, you can start to create a world where you can de-link good education from subject expertise in the classroom, as we are finding. And all at once, we start to move to a paradigm where we don't need superheroes in our classrooms. We may just need coaches with great content delivered online who can help students learn that same content better and work together to create knowledge. And perhaps then we can solve problems like we have in India of finding 1 million coaches. Thank you.